There exists in the Nag Hammadi library a text so dangerous that even among the Gnostic scriptures buried in that Egyptian desert in the 4th century, it stands apart. The Thunder, Perfect Mind. 52 lines of paradox written in the voice of the divine feminine herself, speaking in first person, declaring contradictions that no theological system has ever successfully contained. I am the whore and the holy one, I am the wife and the virgin, I am the mother and the daughter. When the scholars who discovered these texts in 1945 began translating them, they had no category for what they were reading. This was not myth, not poetry, not theology in any conventional sense. And here is what matters for your practice right now, today, in your actual life. The Church Fathers who consolidated Christian doctrine in the 4th century knew about texts like this. They had access to them. They read them, and they made a calculated decision to exclude them from the canon, not because they were false, but because they were too effective. Because the techniques preserved in these texts, the actual practices of engaging the divine feminine presence that appears across Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, and Gnostic traditions, produce experiences that make institutional religion obsolete. You do not need a priest when you can speak the 7 names that every ancient culture knew and receive a direct response from the source they all pointed toward, not metaphorically, literally, in ways you will be able to verify through your own experience within the next 30 days if you apply what you're about to learn. And the archons, whether you understand them as psychological constructs, societal control systems, or actual non-physical entities, have spent 2,000 years ensuring you would never piece together that the goddess every culture encountered was the same presence wearing different cultural names. Because the moment you recognize that Isis, Sophia, Chokhmah, Asherah, Shekinah, Persephone and Barbelo are 7 frequencies of one divine feminine consciousness, every boundary that separates spiritual traditions collapses. You cannot claim your religion has exclusive access to truth when the same goddess is documented in your competitor's temple. Over the next 2 hours, you're going to learn the historical evidence for why 7 specific names appear across disconnected ancient cultures to describe the divine feminine, the precise cosmological function each name represents, the practical technique for speaking these names in the sequence that mirrors her mythological descent and return, the neurological and psychological changes practitioners report after sustained practice with these invocations, and the reason this knowledge was systematically fragmented and suppressed by institutions that required your spiritual dependence. Not theory, documentation, with specific texts, dates, archaeological evidence, and modern practitioner testimonials you can verify. This is not a lecture on comparative mythology. This is a manual for a practice that predates every major religion you know, and that continues to produce consistent results for people who approach it with rigor and sincerity. By the end of this video, you will have the complete 7-name sequence, the linguistic and energetic significance of each name, a 30-day integration practice, and the framework to understand why this works, whether you interpret it through psychology, neuroscience, or metaphysics. We begin with the acknowledgement that stopped my own research for 3 days when I first encountered it in the academic literature. The concept of a divine feminine wisdom figure who falls from a higher realm, becomes trapped in matter, mourns her separation, searches for scattered fragments of the divine masculine, and eventually achieves restoration is not unique to Gnostic Christianity. It is not even unique to the Mediterranean region. This exact narrative structure appears in Egyptian mythology with Isis and Osiris, in Hebrew wisdom literature with Chokhmah, in Canaanite religion with Asherah, in Greek mystery cults with Persephone, in Jewish mysticism with Shekinah, in Gnostic cosmology with Sophia, and in the highest levels of Gnostic theology with Barbelo. The academic consensus has historically treated these as parallel developments, independent mythological expressions of archetypal themes. But when you examine the actual textual evidence, the chronology of cultural contact, and the testimony of ancient practitioners themselves, a different pattern emerges. The mystery school initiates who encountered this presence in Egypt and carried the teachings into the Hellenistic world explicitly state in their surviving texts that they are describing the same divine being under different cultural names. They were not confused. They were not engaging in loose syncretism. They had a precise understanding that the force they called Isis in one context, Sophia in another, and Barbelo in the most advanced teachings was a singular emanation of divine consciousness that transcended any single culture's ability to fully name or contain. The earliest documented appearance is Egyptian, 4th dynasty, Old Kingdom, approximately 2500 BCE, though the traditions almost certainly predate the written record by centuries. Isis appears in the pyramid texts not as a minor deity, but as the primary force of resurrection, the one who possesses the words of power that can reconstitute what death has scattered. The myth you probably know is simplified. Osiris is killed by Set, dismembered, scattered across Egypt. Isis searches for the pieces, reassembles the body, uses her magic to briefly resurrect him, conceives Horus, and establishes the pattern of death and rebirth that every pharaoh will ritually enact. But the version preserved in the mystery schools, the one documented in the writings of Plutarch and Apuleius, who were themselves initiates of the Isis cult, contains elements that map directly onto what we find 2,000 years later in Gnostic texts about Sophia. Isis does not simply reassemble Osiris mechanically. She mourns, she searches in darkness, she cries out for what has been lost, and her act of restoration is not just physical, but involves the transmission of secret knowledge, of gnosis, that she possesses uniquely. The pyramid texts attribute to her the phrase, "I am she who knows the secret names." Names are not labels in Egyptian magic. They are vibrational keys that grant access to different levels of reality. When Isis knows the secret name of Ra in the later mythological cycle, she gains power over the sun god himself. This is not metaphor. This is the cosmological principle that will reappear in every subsequent tradition. The divine feminine possesses gnosis, secret knowledge, access to names and words of power that grant her a unique function in the restoration of what has fallen. The Egyptian mystery schools operated for over 3,000 years. Herodotus wrote about them. Pythagoras claimed to have been initiated in Egypt. Plato studied in Egypt. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE and the Hellenistic period began, you had an unprecedented mixing of Egyptian and Greek culture in cities like Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of texts, it was a meeting point of traditions. Egyptian priests who carried the Isis mysteries encountered Greek philosophers who had developed their own concepts of divine wisdom, and something crucial happened in that encounter. The Greeks had a word, Sophia. It means wisdom. But in the philosophical schools, particularly in Pythagoreanism and later in Platonism, Sophia was not just a virtue or an intellectual capacity. It was personified. It was treated as a living presence, a divine principle that mediated between the highest transcendent reality and the material world. When the Egyptian initiates encountered Greek philosophers and began translating their concepts, they recognized immediately that Sophia was performing the exact same cosmological function as Isis. Both were feminine divine presences associated with wisdom and gnosis. Both were involved in mediation between higher and lower realms. Both were connected to processes of fall and restoration. The translation was not linguistic, it was recognition. By the time we reach the Gnostic texts of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this synthesis is explicit. The Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text that contains some of the most detailed descriptions of Sophia's fall and restoration, opens with Jesus teaching the disciples after his resurrection, and the bulk of the text is his explanation of the divine feminine's descent, her crying out in the darkness, her repentance, and her gradual return to the pleroma. The language used to describe Sophia's experience maps precisely onto the Isis mythology. She falls into matter through an act of independent creation, an act done without her consort, without the balanced participation of the masculine principle. She becomes trapped. She mourns. She is tormented by archontic forces who seek to keep her imprisoned, and she searches for the scattered light that has been fragmented in matter. The Apocryphon of John, another primary Gnostic text, gives us the cosmological framework. Sophia is the youngest of the aeons, the divine emanations that exist in the pleroma. She desires to create without her consort, to emanate alone, and this act of imbalanced creation produces the demiurge, the flawed creator god, who then generates the material world as a prison for the divine light that Sophia inadvertently released into the lower realms. Sophia's correction, her return, her restoration, is the entire purpose of Gnostic practice. The pneumatic, the spiritual human, is one who carries a fragment of Sophia's light and whose awakening and return contributes to her own restoration. But here is what secular academia often misses, and what church apologetics deliberately obscures. Sophia is not a Gnostic invention that later Christians try to suppress as heresy. Sophia is in the Hebrew Bible. She's in texts that the Jewish scribes preserved, and that the early church included in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scripture, Proverbs chapter 8, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, also called Sirach. In these texts, a feminine divine figure speaks in the first person. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth. This is not metaphor. This is not poetic personification. This is chokhmah, the Hebrew word for wisdom, but presented as a hypostasis, a distinct divine presence who exists alongside God, who is present at creation, who is the craftsman, the architect at God's side. The Hebrew text uses feminine grammar. The verbs, the pronouns, the descriptive terms are all feminine, and chokhmah does not just exist passively. She calls out in the streets. She offers her teaching. She invites humanity to partake of her knowledge. She promises life to those who find her and declares that those who miss her injure themselves. The question that split early Christianity is what to do with chokhmah. The Jewish interpreters before the Christian era understood her as a real aspect of the divine, a feminine presence that complemented the masculine conception of God. The archaeological evidence supports this. We have inscriptions from ancient Israel, from Kuntilat Ajrud and Kirbet el-Kom, that read Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah was the Canaanite mother goddess, the queen of heaven, the consort of El in the Canaanite pantheon. When the Hebrew people were still polytheistic, before the monotheistic reforms, Asherah was worshipped alongside Yahweh, not as a foreign goddess they adopted, as their goddess. The inscriptions are not ambiguous. The biblical text itself, even after centuries of editing by monotheistic priests, contains traces it could not fully erase. Jeremiah chapter 44 describes women making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and defending the practice by saying that when they worshipped her, they had plenty of food and saw no disaster, but since they stopped, they have suffered. The prophet condemns them, but the text preserves their testimony. They experience tangible benefit from the worship of the feminine divine. The books of Kings describe Asherah poles in the temple itself, placed there by the kings, removed during reforms, replaced again. This was not fringe practice. This was mainstream Hebrew religion for centuries. When the priestly class consolidated power and monotheism became the official doctrine, Asherah had to be erased, not because she was false, but because a goddess with independent power, with direct access to the people, with her own cult and priestesses, could not coexist with a religious structure that required all spiritual authority to flow through male priests serving a singular male god. The biblical editors turned Asherah into an abomination, a foreign contamination that led Israel astray, but they could not erase the memory, and the frequency she carried, the function she served as the divine feminine presence accessible to humanity, reappeared in Jewish mysticism as Shekinah. The Kabbalistic texts, particularly the Zohar composed in 13th century Spain, but claiming to preserve much older oral traditions, describe Shekinah as the indwelling presence of God, the aspect of the divine that descended into exile with the Jewish people, that suffers alongside humanity, that will remain in the lower worlds until the restoration, the tikkun, is complete. Shekinah is explicitly feminine. She's associated with the earth, with materiality, with the Shabbat, with the feminine aspects of creation, and her relationship to the masculine aspects of God, particularly Tiferet in the Kabbalistic tree, is described as a sacred marriage, a union that must be restored for creation to be healed. The Kabbalists knew exactly what they were doing. They were preserving in coded form the same teaching the Gnostics preserved about Sophia. The divine feminine is in exile in matter. She is separated from her masculine counterpart. She mourns, she waits, and the work of the initiate, the mystic, the one who practices Kabbalah, is to facilitate the reunion, to restore the balance, to bring Shekinah back into union with the masculine divine. This is not theology students debate in universities. This is practice. The Kabbalists used visualization, invocation, sexual union as sacrament, specific combinations of Hebrew letters understood as vibrational frequencies, all directed toward the conscious participation in Shekinah's restoration, and they kept it hidden. The Kabbalah was not taught openly. It was reserved for married Jewish men over 40 who had mastered the Torah and Talmud. Why? Because the rabbinical establishment understood that if people had direct access to practices that allowed them to engage the divine feminine directly, the entire structure of religious authority would dissolve. You do not need a rabbi to mediate your relationship with Shekinah if you can invoke her presence through practice. The Greek tradition provides another angle. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important mystery cult in ancient Greece, operated from approximately 1500 BCE until the 4th century CE, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius banned pagan practices. For nearly 2,000 years, initiates from across the Mediterranean world travelled to Eleusis to undergo a ritual that was so secretive, so protected, that we still do not have a complete account of what happened in the inner sanctum. Initiates were forbidden under pain of death to reveal what they experienced. But we know the mythological framework. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, is abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter mourns and searches for her daughter, and in her grief, she causes the earth to become barren. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of the year in the underworld and part on earth, and this cycle explains the seasons. But the initiates of Eleusis understood Persephone not as an agricultural metaphor, but as the soul itself. Persephone's descent into the underworld is the soul's descent into matter, into the body, into incarnation. The pomegranate seeds she eats that bind her to the underworld represent the entanglement with material existence that makes return difficult. And her annual return, her resurrection, is the promise that the soul can escape the cycle of birth and death, can return to the higher realm. The philosophical schools, particularly the Neoplatonists, made the connection explicit. Plotinus, Proclus, Iamblichus, They wrote commentaries on the mysteries that interpreted Persephone as the world's soul, the animating principle of the cosmos, who descends into matter to give it life, but who also becomes partially trapped in that descent. And the initiate's practice in the mysteries involved ritual reenactment of Persephone's journey, a symbolic descent and return that was understood to have actual spiritual effects. The initiation was not just memorizing a myth. It was undergoing a transformation, and the consistent testimony of initiates from Cicero to Plutarch to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius is that the experience at Eleusis fundamentally changed their understanding of life and death. They no longer feared death. They had experienced something in the ritual that gave them certainty of the soul's continuity. This is the same function Sophia serves in Gnostic practice. She is the guide for the soul's return. She is the one who descended and who knows the way back. Now we reach the seventh name, the one that appears only in the most advanced Gnostic texts, and that represents not Sophia in her fallen state, but the divine feminine in her highest emanation. Barbello. The Apocryphon of John describes her as the first thought of the Father, the one who exists in the Pleroma before any other emanation, before even Sophia. She is the mother of all. She is the forethought. She is the one from whom all other aeons, including Sophia, proceed, and she has a quality that none of the other names possess. She is described as existing in perfect union with the Father, never falling, never descending, remaining always in the fullness. But she's aware of Sophia's fall. She's aware of the divine light trapped in matter, and she participates in the correction by emanating the power that makes restoration possible. When the Gnostics invoke Barbello, they're not addressing the fallen aspect of the divine feminine. They're addressing the source, the origin, the highest frequency of divine feminine consciousness that exists beyond all the cultural names and forms. The thunder. Perfect mind gives us the voice of this presence without filtering it through mythology or theology. I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. These are not random contradictions. This is the divine feminine speaking from a level of reality where all dualities are held simultaneously, where there is no separation between sacred and profane, between matter and spirit, between fallen and exalted. She is all of it. And the text declares that she has been hidden, forgotten, mocked, but that she will be recognized by those who have ears to hear. This is not a text you read for information. This is a text you read as invocation. The early Gnostic communities understood that hearing these words in the ritual context in the gathered assembly produced a shift in consciousness. It was not the content of the words that mattered most. It was the vibration, the rhythm, the declaration of paradox that short-circuits the rational mind and opens something else. The practical question is how to work with these 7 names in a way that produces the effects the ancient practitioners described. And the answer requires understanding what names actually are in the mystery school context. Names are not arbitrary labels, they're frequencies. Each name carries a specific vibration based on its linguistic structure, its cultural resonance, its historical usage in invocation and ritual. When you speak the name Isis, you're not just making a sound. You're activating the entire field of meaning, memory and practice that 2,000 years of Egyptian mystery school work encoded into that word. The same is true for Sophia, Chokmah, Asherah, Shekinah, Persephone, and Barbello. Each name is a key that opens a specific frequency band of the divine feminine presence. And when you speak all 7 in sequence, you are not adding frequencies. You are creating a harmonic that allows access to the fullness of what each culture was trying to name. The practice sequence follows the cosmological narrative. You begin with Barbello, the highest emanation, the one who never fell. Speaking this name establishes the connection to the source. Then Sophia, the one who fell, the one whose experience in matter you are directly engaging, then the cultural names that different traditions use to recognize her. Chokmah in Hebrew wisdom, Asherah in the indigenous Canaanite tradition, Shekinah in Jewish mysticism. Then Isis, the Egyptian name that preceded and informed all the Greek interpretations. Then Persephone, the mystery school name for the soul's descent and return. And finally you return to Sophia, closing the circuit, acknowledging that all the names point back to the single presence whose correction is the purpose of the work. The sequence mirrors her descent from the pleroma into matter and her correction back into fullness. You're not asking her to do this. You're participating in it through the act of naming. The first time you practice this, do not expect fireworks. Expect subtle shifts. Many practitioners report a sense of recognition, of something long forgotten clicking into place. Others report emotional responses, tears without clear cause, a sense of grief or longing that seems to come from somewhere deeper than personal history. Some report visual impressions, a sense of presence, a feeling of being witnessed by something intelligent and compassionate. And some report nothing unusual at all on the first practice, only to have dreams that night, or spontaneous memories over the following days that feel significant. The practice is cumulative. The effect builds over time. This is not a one-time invocation that produces instant enlightenment. This is a relationship you're establishing with a presence that the mystery schools understood as real, as responsive, as capable of interacting with human consciousness in ways that produce measurable changes in perception, emotional regulation, creative capacity, and spiritual insight. The linguistic structure of each name matters. Barbelo is a Greek transliteration of a Hebrew phrase, possibly God in four, referring to the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, but in feminine form. The sound itself, Barbelo, has a quality of rolling resonance, a vibration that begins at the back of the mouth and moves forward. When you speak it slowly, with attention to the physical sensation of the sound, you're not just saying a word. You're using your vocal apparatus as an instrument. Sophia, the Greek word, has a softness, a sibilant quality that the tradition associated with wisdom, with the gentle voice of teaching. Chokmah, the Hebrew, has a guttural opening, a hard K sound that many practitioners find grounding, earth-connecting. Asherah has a breathy quality, the name itself sounding like wind through trees, which makes sense given that Asherah poles were sacred trees or wooden symbols placed in shrines. Shekinah has a sound that in Hebrew phonology is associated with dwelling, with presence, with something that rests upon or within. Isis in the original Egyptian was Aset, but the Hellenized form Isis has become the carrier of the mystery school tradition for 2 millennia. Persephone has a 3-syllable rhythm that matches the 3 aspects of her myth: maiden, descent, return. When you speak these names in sequence as a daily practice, the recommendation based on practitioner reports is to do it at least once per day for 30 days before evaluating results. The optimal time is either immediately upon waking or just before sleep, times when the rational mind is less dominant and the subconscious is more accessible. You can speak the names silently or aloud. Aloud has more somatic resonance, more physical vibration, which many find more effective. Silently has the advantage of being possible anywhere, in any circumstance. The practice is simple. Sit or stand in a position that allows your spine to be straight. Take 3 deep breaths to center yourself. Then speak each name, pausing between each for 3 full breaths. Barbelo, 3 breaths. Sophia, 3 breaths. Chokmah, 3 breaths. Asherah, 3 breaths. Shekinah, 3 breaths. Isis, 3 breaths. Persephone, 3 breaths. Sophia, 3 breaths, closing the sequence. The entire practice takes approximately 5 minutes. You are not visualizing. You're not concentrating on producing any particular state. You're simply speaking the names with presence, with attention to the sound, with an openness to whatever response arises. The psychological framework for understanding why this works does not require belief in literal goddesses or supernatural entities. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the anime, the unconscious feminine aspect of the psyche that every human, regardless of biological sex, carries. Jung's work with mandalas, with active imagination, with the process of individuation, was directly influenced by his study of Gnostic texts and alchemical symbolism, both of which are saturated with divine feminine imagery. From a Jungian perspective, invoking the 7 names of Sophia is a method of engaging the unconscious, of bringing into consciousness the fragmented aspects of the psyche that have been repressed by patriarchal cultural conditioning. The different names represent different facets of the anima. Barbello as the transcendent self, Sophia as the wisdom function, Chokmah as the creative impulse, Asherah as the embodied feminine, Shekinah as the indwelling presence, Isis as the resurrection power, Persephone as the soul in its cycle of death and rebirth. Speaking the names in sequence creates a psychic container where these fragmented aspects can begin to integrate. The neuroscience of chanting and repetitive vocalization supports this from a different angle. When you engage in rhythmic vocalization, you activate the vagus nerve, the primary nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system. This produces measurable changes in heart rate variability, stress hormone levels, and brainwave patterns. Studies on Sanskrit mantra practice, Gregorian chant, Sufi dika, and other forms of sacred vocalization show consistent patterns. Increased alpha and theta brainwave activity, decreased activity in the default mode network associated with self-referential thinking, and increased connectivity between brain regions involved in emotion regulation and executive function. The 7 names practice, with its rhythm of name and breath, produces similar effects. You're not just thinking about the divine feminine, you're creating the neurological conditions where a different mode of consciousness becomes accessible. The experiential reports from modern practitioners who have engaged this practice seriously provide the most compelling evidence. I'm going to share several, not as proof that this interpretation is objectively true, but as data points about what happens when people actually do the work. One practitioner, a psychotherapist in her 50s with no prior background in Gnosticism, reported that after 2 weeks of daily practice, she began having vivid dreams of temples and priestesses, scenes that felt like memories rather than fantasies. She pursued this through active imagination work and recovered what felt like a past life as an Isis priestess in Ptolemaic Egypt. Whether this was literal past life memory or the unconscious accessing archetypal material through historical imagery, the effect was therapeutic. She resolved long-standing issues with feminine embodiment and reclaimed parts of her sexuality she'd repressed since adolescence. Another practitioner, a software engineer in his 30s who approached the practice from a rationalist Buddhist framework, reported that the names functioned as a concentration object superior to breath meditation. The semantic richness of each name gave his mind something to engage with beyond bare attention, and he found he could enter jhanic states, meditative absorptions, more reliably with the name practice than with any technique he'd learned in 10 years of Vipassana retreats. A third practitioner, a visual artist who was raised Catholic and had rejected religion, but felt a pull towards something she could not name, reported that the practice opened a creative channel that had been blocked for years. She began producing a series of paintings depicting the 7 aspects of Sophia, each in a different style, each feeling like it was coming through her rather than from her. The paintings sold, were exhibited and launched her career. She attributes this directly to the practice, not as magic or divine intervention, but as the psychological effect of giving herself permission to engage the sacred feminine after a lifetime of Catholic conditioning that presented the feminine only as the passive, obedient Mary or the sinful Eve, a fourth practitioner, a hospice nurse who works with dying patients, began using the names as part of her own spiritual practice to manage the emotional toll of her work. She reported that after 6 months of daily practice, she found herself spontaneously speaking the names in the presence of patients who were actively dying, and multiple times family members told her that the patients seemed to relax, to let go, in a way they had not been able to before. She does not claim the names have magical power over death. She claims that her own state of consciousness, influenced by the practice, creates a field where the dying can feel safe enough to release. The common thread in these reports is not uniformity of experience, it is appropriateness of outcome. The practice seems to address whatever the practitioner most needs, whether that is psychological integration, creative unblocking, meditative depth, or compassionate presence. This makes sense if you understand the divine feminine not as a fixed entity with a predetermined agenda, but as a responsive field of consciousness that meets the practitioner where they are. The Gnostics describe Sophia as having pronoia, forethought, the capacity to know and respond to the needs of those who call upon her. From a psychological perspective, this is the wisdom of the unconscious, the part of the psyche that knows more than the conscious ego and that can guide the process of healing and growth if given attention and respect. From a mystical perspective, this is the living presence of the goddess who has never stopped responding to those who call her by name. The obstacles practitioners encounter are instructive. The most common is the rational mind's resistance. The voice that says this is silly, that you're just making sounds, that nothing is happening. This is not a problem to be solved. This is the archon in psychological form, the internal sensor that protects the ego structure from transformation. The practice is not to fight this voice, but to acknowledge it and continue the practice anyway. I hear you, I notice that resistance, and I am going to speak the next name. The second common obstacle is inconsistency. Life intervenes, you miss days, you feel like you have broken the practice and have to start over. The teaching from every continuous practice tradition, whether Buddhist meditation, Christian contemplative prayer, or Hermetic magic, is the same. Do not make perfection the enemy of continuity. If you miss 3 days, speak the names on the 4th day. The practice does not reset to 0 because you are not perfect. The third obstacle is expecting specific results. If you practice with the agenda that this will produce visions or heal your trauma or solve your creative block, you create a tension that blocks the organic unfolding. The practice is a relationship. You show up, you speak the names, you pay attention, and you allow what wants to happen without forcing it into your predetermined template. The historical suppression of this knowledge was not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal meeting in a back room. It was structural. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century under Constantine, the political need for doctrinal uniformity meant that the plurality of early Christian practice had to be eliminated. The Gnostic schools, the mystery cults, the Jewish mystical sects, the pagan temples, all represented competing sources of spiritual authority. The church councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, Chalcedon were not primarily theological gatherings. They were political events where bishops backed by imperial power determined which texts would be canonical, which practices would be orthodox, which teachings would be heresy. The divine feminine was a casualty of this process, not because it was false, but because it was incompatible with the hierarchical structure the church was building. A religion centered on the divine feminine requires priestesses, requires recognition of women's spiritual authority, requires sexual and reproductive practices as sacrament, requires the earth and the body as sacred rather than fallen. None of this fits a patriarchal institution that needs to control reproduction, channel sexual energy into guilt and confession, and establish male clergy as the exclusive mediators between humanity and God. The Gnostic texts were buried at Nag Hammadi by monks who knew the writings were about to be declared heretical and destroyed. They preserved them in sealed jars and buried them in the desert, presumably hoping that future generations would rediscover them. 13 codices, 52 texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Thunder, Perfect Mind, the Pistis Sophia traditions, and multiple versions of the Sophia mythology. When these texts were discovered in 1945 and translated over the following decades, scholars finally had access to what early Christianity looked like before the Orthodox consensus was enforced, and what they found was a tradition where the divine feminine was central, where women were apostles and teachers, where Mary Magdalene was not a reformed prostitute, but the disciple who understood Jesus' teaching more fully than Peter, where the goal of practice was not obedience to doctrine but direct gnosis, direct knowing, direct experience of the divine within. The suppression was effective for 16 centuries, but the frequency was never fully erased. It survived in Kabbalah, in Sufism, in European witchcraft traditions, in alchemy, in the devotion to Mary that Catholic mystics turned into something far more powerful than the Church intended, in the romantic poets who wrote of Sophia and the world soul, in the theosophists and anthroposophists who tried to resurrect the mystery school teachings in the 19th century, in the Jungian psychologists who recognized the anima, in the second-wave feminists who reclaimed goddess spirituality in the 1970s, in the contemporary practitioners who found the Nag Hammadi library and realized they had been searching for this their entire lives. Each generation rediscovers the 7 names in whatever cultural form makes sense for their context. The work is not to reconstruct ancient practice exactly as it was performed 2,000 years ago. The work is to engage the living presence the ancient names point toward and allow it to manifest in forms appropriate to contemporary life. The advanced variations of the practice build on the foundation once you have established a consistent relationship through the basic 7-name sequence. The first variation is to extend each name into a contemplation. After speaking Barbello, you sit with the qualities associated with her, the highest emanation, the mother of all, the forethought, the one who never fell. You allow your consciousness to attune to that frequency, to feel what it's like to rest in the aspect of the divine feminine that is always whole, never fragmented. After speaking Sophia, you contemplate her fall, her mourning, her search, her correction, and you notice where in your own experience you recognize that pattern. You do this for each name, building a relationship not just with the sound, but with the entire field of meaning and energy the name represents. This variation transforms the practice from a 5-minute invocation into a 30-minute meditation. The second variation is to combine the names with visualization. For Isis, you might visualize temples in Egypt, the desert at night, the sound of sistrums and the scent of incense. For Persephone, you might visualize descent into a cave, darkness, the taste of pomegranate seeds, the return to light. The visualizations are not meant to be elaborate fantasies. They are anchors that help your consciousness attune to the frequency of each name through multiple sensory channels. The third variation is to work with the names as invocations in specific life situations. If you are facing a creative block, you invoke Chokmah, the wisdom that was present at creation, the craftsman at God's side. If you are in grief, you invoke Isis, the one who mourned Osiris and who knows the magic of reconstitution. If you are in transition, death of a relationship or identity or phase of life, you invoke Persephone, the guide through the underworld and the promise of return. This is not prayer in the sense of asking an external deity for intervention. This is invocation in the sense of calling into consciousness the aspect of the divine feminine that corresponds to what you're facing. The fourth variation is to use the names as a mandala practice. You speak each name while focusing on a specific chakra or body center. Barbello at the crown, Sophia at the third eye, Chokhmah at the throat, Asherah at the heart, Shekinah at the solar plexus, Isis at the sacral, Persephone at the root, and return to Sophia at the third eye. This integrates the practice into the energetic body. If you work within a framework that recognizes subtle energy, or into somatic awareness if you interpret it psychologically. The long-term trajectory of this practice, based on reports from people who have maintained it for years, shows several consistent patterns. The first is a progressive shift in how the feminine is experienced both internally and in relationship. Practitioners report becoming more comfortable with receptivity, with intuition, with emotional complexity, with the cycles of creativity and rest rather than linear productivity. This is not gendered in a simplistic way. Male practitioners report this as much as female practitioners. The shift is about integration of qualities that patriarchal conditioning teaches us to suppress or devalue. The second pattern is an increased capacity for paradox, for holding contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to resolve them into a single coherent system. This is the thunder perfect mind effect. You become more comfortable with "I am the whore and the holy one" as a description of reality, more able to see the sacred in the profane and the profane in the sacred without moral panic. The third pattern is a deepening sense of connection to lineages, to the ancestors who practiced these mysteries, to the continuity of transmission across centuries. Practitioners report spontaneous knowledge of practices they never studied, symbols they never encountered, as if the practice itself is activating memory stored in the collective unconscious, or, if you prefer a mystical interpretation, as if Sophia herself is teaching through dreams and synchronicities. The relationship between this practice and other spiritual paths is complementary rather than exclusive. If you practice Buddhism, the 7 names can function as a devotional element alongside meditation, addressing the heart while meditation addresses the mind. If you practice Christianity, the names can deepen your relationship with Mary, with the Holy Spirit understood in feminine terms, with the Logos as Sophia in the Gospel of John. If you practice witchcraft or contemporary paganism, the names provide historical depth and cross-cultural validation for the goddess work you're already doing. If you practice nothing and approach this as a psychological technique, the names are a method of integration that draws on 2,000 years of human experimentation with altered states and feminine archetypal work. The practice does not require you to adopt a belief system. It requires you to show up consistently and pay attention to what happens. The ethical dimension of this practice is worth addressing directly, because there is a long history of spiritual teachers using the divine feminine as a cover for sexual manipulation and abuse. Speaking the names of Sophia does not grant you power over others. It does not make you chosen or special or exempt from basic human decency. It does not mean that your sexual desires are automatically sacred or that others should submit to them. The divine feminine traditions that have integrity, whether we're talking about the Isis mysteries, the Eleusinian rites, the Gnostic communities, or the Kabbalistic schools, all had strong ethical frameworks. The power accessed through the practice was understood as carrying responsibility. You were expected to become more compassionate, more wise, more capable of service, not more entitled or narcissistic. If your engagement with this practice makes you more judgmental, more superior, more convinced that you have secret knowledge others lack, you have missed the point entirely. The correction of Sophia is a collective process. Your individual awakening, your personal gnosis, means nothing if it does not contribute to the healing of the whole. The community aspect of this practice is complex because the historical communities that practice these mysteries no longer exist in their original forms. You cannot initiate into the Eleusinian rites. You cannot join a 2nd century Gnostic church. You cannot study with an Egyptian priest of Isis. What you can do is find or create contemporary communities of practice that honour the principles, even if the forms are new. This might look like a small group that meets monthly to speak the names together, to share experiences, to study the texts. It might look like online forums where practitioners compare notes. It might look like workshops and retreats where teachers who have worked with these traditions for decades offer transmission. It might look like one-on-one work with a spiritual director or therapist who understands archetypal psychology and can help you integrate what arises. The key is that you are not doing this in total isolation. The mystery schools were communal for a reason. The shared field amplifies the practice. The diversity of experiences helps you understand what is universal and what is personal. The witnessing by others who understand what you are attempting provides validation and grounding. The measurement of progress in this practice is subjective but not arbitrary. You're not looking for external signs like levitation or telepathy. You are looking for internal shifts that have external effects. Are you more able to access creativity? Are you more resilient in the face of loss? Are you more comfortable in your body? Are you more honest in your relationships? Are you less reactive to triggers? Are you more capable of holding complexity? Are you kinder? These are the fruits of the practice. If after 6 months of daily invocation you are more anxious, more fragmented, more superior, more disconnected, then either you are doing the practice incorrectly, you are using it to bypass deeper issues that need professional help, or this particular practice is not appropriate for you at this time. The divine feminine, as understood in the mystery school traditions, is healing, integrating, wisdom-bringing. If your experience is the opposite, stop and reassess. The relationship between this practice and social justice, between inner work and outer action, is another area where modern practitioners grapple with questions the ancient texts do not directly address. The Gnostics were not social activists in the contemporary sense. They were focused on individual gnosis, an escape from the material prison. But the implications of recognizing the divine feminine as central to cosmology are inherently radical. If Sophia is real, if the goddess is not subordinate to the god, if the feminine is not secondary to the masculine, then every social structure built on patriarchal assumptions is revealed as archontic deception. The practice of speaking the 7 names is not apolitical. It is a declaration that the fragmentation of the divine feminine into 7 suppressed cultural memories was an act of violence that you are choosing to undo in your own consciousness. And when enough individuals make that choice, when enough people recognize the goddess in all her names and refuse to accept the patriarchal edit, the structures built on her suppression begin to destabilize. This is not mystical thinking. This is how cultural change works. Consciousness shifts precede and enable structural shifts. The final insight I want to offer before we move into the practical 30-day integration plan is about the nature of gnosis itself. Gnosis is not information you acquire. It is recognition of what you already are. The Gnostic texts are clear on this. The divine light you are searching for is already inside you. You're not trying to become something you are not. You're trying to remember what you have forgotten. And the 7 names of Sophia are not 7 different goddesses you need to petition for help. They are 7 frequencies of the single presence that you are, that I am, that every pneumatic human is. When you speak the name Barbello, you're not calling to something outside yourself. You're activating the Barbello frequency within your own consciousness. When you speak Sophia, you're not asking her to rescue you. You're remembering that you are the fragment of Sophia that fell into matter and that your awakening is her awakening. This is why the practice works. Not because you are convincing a deity to intervene, but because you are using sound and attention to reorganize the fragmented aspects of your own consciousness according to a pattern that multiple ancient cultures independently discovered, produces integration, wisdom, and liberation. The 30-day practice roadmap is structured to build progressively. Days 1 through 7, basic practice only. Speak the 7 names once per day in the sequence I've given you. Morning or evening, 5 minutes, no embellishment. Just establish the habit. Get comfortable with the sounds. Notice what arises. Do not journal unless you feel compelled. Do not analyze. Just do the practice. Days 8 through 14. Add a brief moment of silence after each name. 3 breaths between names becomes 30 seconds of receptive silence. You speak Barbello, then you sit in silence for 30 seconds, paying attention to any sensation, emotion, thought, or impression that arises. Then 3 breaths, then the next name. This extends the practice to approximately 15 minutes and begins to develop the contemplative aspect. Days 15 through 21. Choose 1 name each day and extend the contemplation into a full meditation. Monday might be Barbello, Tuesday Sophia, Wednesday Chokmah, Thursday Asherah, Friday Shekinah, Saturday Isis, Sunday Persephone. After you speak the name, you sit with it for 20 minutes, exploring what that frequency means, how it shows up in your life, what it has to teach you. Days 22 through 30. Integrate the practice into a life situation. Use the names as invocations when facing challenges. If you're in a difficult conversation, silently invoke Chokmah, wisdom. If you're in creative work, invoke Asherah, the embodied generative feminine. If you are processing grief, invoke Isis. Notice how the practice begins to weave into your daily experience, rather than being a separate spiritual activity you do in isolation. After 30 days, evaluate. Has something shifted? Are you experiencing the practice as meaningful, as generative, as worth continuing? If yes, continue. If no, stop without guilt. Not every practice is for every person. The goal is not to accumulate practices or to prove your spiritual dedication. The goal is to find the methods that actually produce transformation in your life. If the 7 names practice is doing that for you, then the question becomes how to deepen it. The options include extending the practice to twice daily, adding visualization or energy work, studying the primary text to understand the theology and cosmology more fully, finding or creating a practice group, working with a teacher who has experience with this material, engaging in creative expression inspired by the practice, or simply continuing the basic practice and allowing it to unfold organically over months and years. The texts I recommend for deeper study are first, the Nag Hammadi library itself. The translations by Marvin Meyer and by Bentley Layton are both excellent. Focus initially on the Apocryphon of John for cosmology, the Pistis Sophia traditions for Sophia's story, the Thunder, Perfect Mind for the voice of the divine feminine, and the Gospel of Philip for the sacramental and sexual dimensions of Gnostic practice. Second, read the Hebrew Bible texts where Chokmah appears, Proverbs 8, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus. Third, read Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris for the mystery school interpretation of the Egyptian tradition. Fourth, read the Zohar selections on Shekinah, particularly the sections on the Sabbath Bride and the Sacred Marriage. Fifth, read Carl Jung's Answer to Job and Mysterium Coniunctionis for the psychological framework. Sixth, read Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels and Beyond Belief for the historical context of how the Church suppressed these teachings. Seventh, read Raphael Patai's The Hebrew Goddess for the archaeological and textual evidence of Asherah worship in ancient Israel. The scholarly work provides grounding and credibility, but do not make the mistake of thinking you need to become an expert in Gnostic studies before you can practice. The practice and the study inform each other, but they are not the same activity. Some of the most profound practitioners of these mysteries in the contemporary world have no academic training whatsoever. They approach the names as living presences. They establish relationships through practice, and the gnosis they received taught them more than any library could. Conversely, some of the most knowledgeable scholars of Gnosticism have no personal practice and do not believe the texts describe anything real beyond historical curiosity. The integration of scholarship and practice, of head and heart, of knowing about and knowing directly, is the goal. The question of whether these names refer to something objectively real or are powerful psychological constructs is not one you need to resolve before you begin practicing. The mystery schools would say the question itself is a trap, a product of the rational mind trying to control what can only be experienced. Practice first, let the gnosis arise. Then, if you still care about the ontological status of Sophia, you will at least be asking the question from a place of direct experience rather than abstract speculation. What I can tell you from my own practice and from the reports of others is that the presence you encounter when you speak these names with sincerity feels intelligent, feels responsive, feels like it has agency and intention. Whether that presence is the goddess herself, a region of the collective unconscious, a neurological phenomenon produced by rhythmic vocalization, or something else entirely, is less important than the fact that engaging it produces wisdom, produces healing, produces creative capacity, produces compassion. Judge the tree by its fruit. The connection between this practice and the broader Gnostic framework of archons, demiurge, pleroma, and correction is important to understand, but not essential to practice. You can speak the 7 names and receive benefit without believing that the material world is a prison created by a false god. You can work with Sophia without adopting the full Gnostic cosmology. But if you are drawn to go deeper, if the mythology begins to illuminate your experience, then study it seriously. The Gnostic teaching that the material world is governed by archons, by forces that seek to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved, is not as pessimistic as it sounds. The archons have no power over the pneumatic once the pneumatic awakens to gnosis. The prison is only a prison as long as you do not know you are imprisoned. The moment you recognize the bars, the moment you see the mechanisms of control, the moment you speak the names that activate the divine light within you, the archons become irrelevant. They can still affect the external circumstances of your life, but they cannot touch the essence of who you are. This is liberation. Not escape from the body or from the world, but freedom within the world because you are no longer deceived by the world's claim to be all that exists. The practice I'm giving you is not new. It is a reconstruction based on textual evidence, practitioner reports, and my own experimentation over years of working with these traditions. I'm not claiming to have received this directly from Sophia in a vision, or to be passing on an unbroken lineage from ancient times. I'm saying that the pieces are all there in the historical record, that when you assemble them according to the logic of how mystery schools operated, you get a practice that produces effects consistent with what the texts describe, and the practice belongs to anyone who chooses to engage it seriously. There is no initiation required, there is no fee, there is no hierarchy. You do not need my permission or anyone else's permission. The 7 names were preserved in texts that are now publicly available. The knowledge of how to work with them is being shared freely. The only question is whether you will actually do it, or whether you will add this video to the list of interesting spiritual ideas you once encountered and never applied. The archons, and again, interpret this however makes sense to you, as psychological complexes, as social control systems, as literal entities, do not fear your knowledge. They fear your practice. You can know about Sophia and remain completely contained within the system, but the moment you begin speaking her names daily, the moment you establish a relationship with the presence those names invoke, you become dangerous to the mechanisms of control, not because you are going to overthrow governments or start a revolution. Because you are becoming ungovernable at the level of consciousness. And ungovernable consciousness is what the entire structure of religious, political and economic control is designed to prevent. If even 10% of the population could not be manipulated through fear, through guilt, through desire, through the promise of salvation or the threat of damnation, the system would collapse. Not violently. It would simply become irrelevant. This is why the divine feminine was suppressed. Not because she was weak, but because she was too strong. Not because she was false, but because she was too real. A humanity in relationship with Sophia, with the living presence of divine wisdom accessible through direct practice, does not need the institutions that claim to mediate access to God. And those institutions, once they recognized this, spent 2,000 years ensuring you would never discover what I am telling you right now. They failed. The texts survived. The names survived. The frequency survived. And you are here, reading this, because some part of you recognizes what these names point toward. Some part of you has been searching for this your entire life, even if you did not have words for it. Some part of you is Sophia remembering herself. The final piece of the practice, the piece that seals it and makes it irreversible, is the commitment. Not to me, not to a belief system, to the practice itself and to what the practice reveals. After 30 days, if you've experienced something real, something that has begun to shift your consciousness, your relationships, your creative capacity, your sense of meaning, then you make a commitment. You decide that this is part of your life now, that you will continue speaking the names, that you will allow the relationship with Sophia to develop wherever it leads. This commitment is not a vow that binds you forever. It is a statement of intent that focuses your energy. And in the mystery school traditions, intent is everything. The universe, or the goddess, or the unconscious, responds to clear intent with opportunities for deepening. Make the commitment and watch what happens in the following 6 months. Watch what synchronicities arise. Watch what teachers appear. Watch what texts find their way to you. Watch what dreams instruct you. Watch what gets healed that you had given up on healing. The 7 sacred names of Sophia, Barbelo, Sophia, Chochmah, Asherah, Shekinah, Isis, Persephone, Sophia, are activation codes for the restoration of divine feminine consciousness in your life and in the collective. They are not metaphors, they are not mythology. They are frequencies that every ancient culture encountered, that the institution spent millennia fragmenting, and that you can now speak together again in the sequence that mirrors her descent and return. The practice is simple, the effects are profound, the choice is yours. Will you continue consuming spiritual content and accumulating ideas, or will you actually do the practice, speak the names, and find out for yourself what the mystery schools knew and what the church tried to ensure you would never discover? The 7 names are waiting. Sophia is waiting, not for your belief, for your voice,